Welcome to Texas A&M AgriLife Extension's weekly webinar series. This week we're talking turf pests, hosted by myself, Molly Keck, with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension in Bexar County. So this is the turf edition of what pests to kind of look out for this year, but really all year round. Yesterday, David covered everything about how to keep that lawn looking good and the maintenance that it needs. And let's say that even if you're doing some of those things, you still may find that you've got some insect issues that are going on. But thankfully, there aren't a whole lot of insects that really damage our turf. Unfortunately, though, we always blame the insects for anything that looks bad in the grass. So this is kind of a good table of just some common insects that you might find. We're not going to cover every single one of these guys. We're really just going to cover the ones that most of us encounter, which are the grubs. I consider fire ants to be a true pest in the turf. Chinch bugs are another one that we see in the summertime. And then I'll talk a little bit about mole crickets and also armyworms, which usually are not a big problem for us in our landscape, which just really limits us to only 3 things that we have to deal with in our grass, which for a lot of people is the biggest piece of plant that we have covering our the front of our house and even the back of our house. So if you're looking at white grub specifically, a white grub is kind of a generic term for a number of beetles that will become basically one of 3 species. There are hundreds of species of Schaefers or scarabs. And that middle picture that you see right there, there is a very common look to many of the grubs. So just because you see these guys at your porch lights at night doesn't necessarily mean that they are coming out of your grass or going to lay eggs in your grass. And that is what you're seeing in the beetles is the adult form. The form that hurts the grass is the baby form. And the larva is there on the far right hand side, and you can see it fits inside of a quarter. It's a very small type of a grub. So the word grub is just a term that we use for any insect that will become a beetle. White grubs specifically are those that damage our turf, and they're very host specific to just grasses. So if you see grubs in any other part of your landscape, I don't necessarily worry about them. It's the ones that hurt our turf and will be found in our turf that can cause some concern. And the damage that they do is, move this other way so I can see what I'm looking at. The damage that they do is very nondescript. I mean, it kind of looks like a lot of damage. It could be irrigation issues, but the big thing when they get very high in the population is that they feed on the roots, and so the grass can just really be pulled up. And sometimes it's almost like it's a rug instead of anything else. It's like carpet that can be picked up because there's nothing holding it to the soil. But that's when it becomes really bad. But the dead spots that you see on that right hand side, there's nothing about it specifically that tells me that is definitely a white grub. Oh, that's a terrible picture right there. What I'm trying to show you in that picture, and I didn't realize it would come out so blurry, is that one of the bad things about the white grubs is that we will get other animals that will come in and try to feed on those grubs. And just because you see this doesn't necessarily mean that you've got white grubs in the soil, but it's a pretty good indication that something's coming in and rooting around. And usually it's armadillos. If you've got feral hogs in your area, they may not necessarily be looking for grubs. They're just rooting for something. But if you have a little armadillo that's coming back every single night, he's looking for some food. And for some reason, he thinks that there's grubs in there. So for me, for white grubs, knowing the life cycle of these guys helps me know when is the best time to treat. This slide, I don't remember what state it came from, but since we're in Texas, what you can do is just kind of shift the timeline back a couple months. So we see them emerging earlier than you would see in this graph right here. And by actually probably a couple months. So what happens in the winter time, or actually let's start with springtime about right now. In the springtime, these guys are emerging out of the soil as adults. And so this shows it in June, but in reality, we're probably, what are we in the middle of April now? So we're seeing this end of March to beginning of April and on. And again, remember, there are many different species. of these grubs that will emerge. Just because they're out doesn't mean they're white grubs. They will emerge beginning of the spring through the beginning of the summer, just depending on the temperatures. They will be mating, and then they lay their eggs in the soil. They crawl down and they lay their eggs in the soil. Those eggs hatch and those babies start feeding pretty readily. In Texas, they feed June, July, and sometimes into August. Depends on where you are in the state. So if you're far south, they're going to emerge earlier and do damage sooner. If you're further north in the state, they're going to emerge later and do damage a little bit later. If you think of the kind of the middle of the state, I'm thinking of the San Antonio area. If you are found kind of there, then what you should see is the most damage will appear mid-July through August. The best time for us to treat in San Antonio is usually June to July, because that's when those guys are high up in the soil, they're actively feeding, and it's easier for us to kill them. When we get into September, October, November, they start burrowing down and they wait out the winter time as the larva and then start moving up further in the soil in the spring. There is some research that shows that they do some damage feeding right before they pupate and become adults, but they don't do significant damage. So the best time to treat is when they're young, they're like teenagers, they're ravenous, and they're eating all sorts of stuff. So management for these guys is pretty simple. There's lots and lots and lots of products that are out there that you can use. What I would say is that make sure that management is warranted. Do you see damage in your turf? When you peel back some of the turf, are you finding some grubs? And if you're not, then it's probably not grubs that are causing that damage. I have a lot of active ingredients listed out there that you can find for white grub management. It really varies. I couldn't even possibly tell you all the different product names that are out there. Just look for something that has grub in it. But we do know that if you want to apply something a little bit earlier, there are some preventive type things that you can put out. That bifenthrin plus another product is usually added to it. And that's usually labeled and marketed as like a combo product, a preventable product that you could use now, say, if you know that you have a problem with grubs. I'm one who doesn't really like to put out pesticides unless I need to. So I don't like those preventable stuff, but let's say that you absolutely are sure that grubs are your issue every year, then it might be beneficial for you to do that. Later on in the season, if you've waited too late and you're trying to kill those grubs at the end of July or into August, you don't have a lot of options. You have a very short residual with some of these products. So the best thing to do is to treat, if you're in the middle of the state, mid-July. If you're north, do it a little later. And if you're south, do it a little bit sooner. Timing, I think, is so important with white grub management. There are some non-chemical type controls that you can try. Nematodes, of course, are the ones that are the most commonly known. And the thing with those nematodes is that you have to get it from a reputable supplier. So sometimes getting it from, I don't know, a nursery where it's kind of been sitting out in the sun and it's not in a cooler is probably not the best place to purchase it from. So get it from a reputable supplier. They are very, very finicky. The soil has to be extremely wet, always moist. So in Texas, in July, that's not the best time, right? As soon as they touch that soil, they're probably going to start shriveling up and dying. Read the application rates really, really well so that you're putting out the proper amounts. And just know that if there's no food for those nematodes, it's not going to work, right? They're not going to persist. They don't reproduce on their own very well. There's no food, there's no nematodes, they all die off. So it is something that you'll have to reapply often. In my opinion, at least in the field trials where we've done this, you put in a lot of effort and get minimal results. So I would say that there are other and better ways that you can try to control grubs versus using nematodes. Nick, I have Nick done out as the host to help me with this. Nick, if you could just mute everybody for me because I'm hearing a lot of background noise. The other insect that becomes a problem for turf are chinch bugs. Chinch bugs are tiny little things that are usually found kind of more in the thatch of the grass as opposed to being on the stem of the grass. And you can see from the picture there, I think that's a dime that's right there. They're tiny little bitty things, but if you dig into the grass and look closely, you can kind of see them. They're just itty bitty little seals kind of moving around. When they're young and they just hatched out of the egg, I don't know if you can see that kind of redder one in the middle of the hair. That's a brand new nymph, and those can sometimes show up a little bit easier on blades of grass because it just has a better contrast with the green back feeder. I'm sorry, background. The main damage that chinch bugs will do is they feed on a patch of grass, and they will kill that center patch of grass. And then around the edge of where they have fed, you have this yellowed leaf, this look to it. And then beyond that is of course, the live grass. So you kind of see this deadening yellowing and then fine grass after that. And that's the best characteristic to determine that you've got chinch bugs and not something else. The other thing is that the damage generally happens in areas of the lawn where irrigation isn't reaching properly or it's extremely hot. So we'll see it in a situation like this where probably there aren't sprinklers in that little kind of median part of the grass, or they're not sticking the sprinkler head out there to kind of run. And the other thing that makes that a whole lot worse is that not the driveway, not the sidewalk, but the road, I'm sorry, they're on kind of the right-hand side, is really hot. And as it soaks up that heat, it's radiating it back onto the grass. And now that grass is hotter in that spot than in other places. And chinch bugs thrive in the heat. They absolutely love to live in heat. Hot spots of the grass. We'll also see it kind of right at the corner. If you have a corner house, I will see it when it's on the other side of a fence and they have just a little tiny strip between their fence and the road because water isn't getting there. The fence is hot and the road is hot, but up against a sidewalk is another common place where you'll find it. Rarely will you find chinch bugs breeding and doing damage in the center of your lawn, never really in a shaded spot. It's just where the sun beats down all the time or heat is radiating onto that lawn. That is really characteristic of chinch bugs. We also shouldn't see this right now. It's not at all hot enough for chinch bugs to become an issue. These guys become an issue in the dog days of summer. So July, August, maybe even September if it's hot enough. And if we get warm enough early on, we'll see them sooner in the year also. If you live in an area of the state that gets really hot early on, you might see them as soon as now or maybe even into May. So for control of chinch bugs, since they live in the thatch and hang out there, if you can reduce the thatch, then you can reduce the hiding places for them, and that will help control the population somewhat. We know that fertilization, increased nitrogen in the soil is kind of a driver for these guys to stimulate reproduction. So if you can fertilize at the proper time, don't fertilize in the middle of the summer, fertilize when it's the proper time to fertilize. And if you know chinch bugs are always a big problem for you, cut back on fertilization if you can. Increase the moisture somehow, decrease the soil temperature. So up the amount of time that you're watering that lawn, or add another day of irrigation. So sometimes just decreasing the soil temperature keeps them from really thriving and reproducing. And so they just die off on their own, or they get to a level where you don't see damage in your turf. There are some resistant varieties. So if you are trying to think about putting down turf right now and you know that you're not going to be able to irrigate very well, then there are some varieties that are a little bit more resistant to the damage that chinch bugs show. They still will be there, but they don't show the damage like others will. And so Floratam and then FJ Select are two options there. Control of these guys is pretty simple. There's a lot of products, again, that are labeled for them. Very short residual for most of these things. So you want to apply when you start to see damage. You really also want to move that grass around, get down into the thatch and see if you actually see chinch bugs so you're not wasting a lot of this pesticide and not actually killing anything. And also remember that the dead grass is already dead. You can't salvage or save that. So look into the yellowed grass and then what's adjacent to that yellow grass. That's the best place to put down. It's usually a granule that you water in, or it's a liquid pesticide that you'll kind of spray a swath in. And it's a contact. You're trying to kill these on contact and knock them down and hope that they don't rebound a little bit later on. But those are all active ingredients there for chinch bugs. There's so many different products that I couldn't possibly tell you all the common names. What you want to look for there is other options. I saw a message just popped up that said non-chemical alternatives. So that slide that was right there, those are your non-chemical alternatives for chinch bug control. Also, make sure you use the proper pesticide for the proper life cycle found in the grass also, because some of these products are meant for like the little tiny baby nymphs, and some of them are meant for when they're older adults. And if you use them at the wrong time, you don't get the proper control that you're going to need. Mole crickets are a really, really weird, foreign kind of a alien looking insect. They're attracted to lights at night. I think they're extremely interesting. They are a type of cricket, so they're related to regular crickets and grasshoppers, but they look way, way different. Their front legs are modified into these little shovels, so they have huge claws. So they're almost like they have tillers on their toes, and then their hands are shovels, so they can shovel and tunnel through the ground. And when the populations get kind of high in the summertime, you can hear them. They have a very particular chirp that they will do back and forth to one another to try to find a mate. So we have a couple different species throughout most of Texas. The most common one, though, is I think it's the southern mole cricket. They're on the left-hand side. Not that it really necessarily always matters exactly what you've got, but what I think is interesting about those guys, the most common species that we have here is more predatory than it is actually a turf feeder. So again, are they good or bad? It kind of depends on your situation, right? Are your populations high enough that they warrant doing something about them? Except for if you're in southeastern Texas, so if you're south of Houston and further east of Houston, then you probably are going to have the species that does cause mainly only turf damage. But the other guys are like an 80-20% ratio of being predatory versus a turf feeder. But if populations are high enough, that 20% is enough to do some damage. I would also say that with these guys, very rarely are they a lawn pest. I've been doing this and speaking to people for 15 years, and I don't think I've ever come across a situation where mole crickets were truly hurting the lawn. There may have been lawn issues, and they may have seen mole crickets, but it was just kind of a coincidence. Where we usually see them as a big issue is if you manage a golf course or you are a turf farmer, a sod farm or something like that. That's when they become a worse issue. So right now they're doing these little sunset dispersal flights, and they're flying up in the air and they're mating on the fly, and then they're falling down into the ground, and they'll start to lay their eggs right now through July. So if you're down in Corpus area, they're laying their eggs now. If you're a little bit further north, say you're San Antonio to Austin area, give them another month or so. And then if you're way up north in the Panhandle or up in Dallas, closer to Oklahoma, where it's a little bit cooler, they could be laying their eggs all the way through July. It's all dependent on the soil temperature and just the ambient air temperature. When those eggs hatch, usually takes them about 2 weeks to hatch or so, they will start feeding, and they'll feed a lot because they're babies and they need to get bigger. And so most of us will see the severe damage in the late summer to the early fall time. But treating them before that is a better management tool because you never get to the point where they've caused damage. Problem is, how do you even know that you've got them? If you were growing sod or you managed a golf course, this would be part of something that you were always monitoring for. But us as homeowners, they can cause issues and we don't realize it until it's maybe a little bit too late. And again, just because they're coming to your lights at night, I don't think that warrants panicking. This is some of the damage that they'll cause when you start to move the grass away, or you're looking at those dead spots in the grass and you look very close. It looks like they're tunneling, like Bugs Bunny makes a tunnel. And so that's really indicative. Some people will say it almost looks like castings of earthworms. It's not quite the same. It doesn't really mound up like that, but you kind of see the softer pellets that they will form of the soil as they're kind of burrowing through. And then you just have these random splotches of dead grass where they've been doing their active feeding. They're not really colonial where they live together in a family, but they like neighbors. So where you have one, usually they're kind of all together because they know that's a good juicy spot to eat. So the best time to treat for these guys is not just quite yet. It's May through July. And you want to try to get the babies as they're feeding so the damage doesn't actually happen. And one good way to flush them out to identify that they are the cause for that decline in the grass is in the spots where you're seeing the grass patches dying off. Take a gallon of water about and add a little bit of soapy water to it. So they really are repelled. They do not like it, irritates them. The lemon liquid dish detergent, you use a lemon flavored dish detergent in a gallon of water and just dump it right onto that deadening patch, and they will start to kind of pop out of the holes. If you're finding them there and your grass is dying, then I say that's the thumbs up to do something about it. And these are some of the active ingredients that you can find that are labeled for use in your lawn to try to control these guys. There's a lot of other products that are out there for use in, golf courses and other places. You may not find a product that specifically says for mole crickets, but it might be like a lawn management or for killing pests in the lawn, and it kind of gives you a really general term. Just make sure that it's labeled for the lawn and that it is it has one of those active ingredients, in the product, and then you should be doing good. In Texas, we're a location label state, and so the law is that the location you apply your pesticide has to be on the label. You may not necessarily see your specific pest. They'll give you a generic term like lawn pests, chewing pests, sucking pests, something like that. But making sure that the location is on the label is your safest bet. And then one of the last guys we're going to talk about are these little fall armyworms. There are years when these things are out of control. And again, they aren't always an issue for a homeowner in the landscape, but if you say you grow hay or something, you probably have dealt with these guys before. You can see what the adult looks like. It's a boring moth, so if you're killing it, you're not killing anything very pretty if you're concerned about that. Their color will vary from a dark gray to like a brownish color. You can see in the two pictures. The big key characteristic about fall armyworms is that they have an inverted Y on their head, and you can see that in the left-hand picture. It's kind of like the points of the Y kind of come down towards the eyeballs. If you see a Y on the head, you've got a fall armyworm. And fall armyworms have multiple generations, but in the fall, they tend to have the biggest generation of all. So if you're noticing them in the spring, watch out because fall is going to be pretty bad. This is a picture of a football field or a sports field at a high school, and that is not dormant grass, it's dead grass because they have defoliated it nearly completely, and all they've left is just dead spots. Pretty much a dead blanket of grass. So it's very depressing if it happens to you, to say the very least. They primarily feed on grasses that we don't have in our landscape, except for maybe Bermuda grass. But they are known, if they are hungry enough, to eat on anything. I've seen it before where they have just come across a garden, like someone had a big, raised bed garden, and they just kind of walked across it and everything's dead as they're passing. They just chomp as they're going. Initially, if you look at your grass, the tips look transparent because they've just kind of skeletonized it. So they've left like they've taken the green part off and they've just kind of left the skin behind, if that makes sense. And then it will take on the look of being drought stressed, and then it will you'll look closer and you'll see that it's becoming defoliated and there's no more grass left, essentially. And it's going to take a whole year for that grass probably to rebound and come back. Bifenthrin, carbaryl products, cyfluthrin, those are all good products, or those are good active ingredients that you can apply to try to control the armyworms. Reducing thatch is another thing that can be helpful for controlling them because they'll lay their eggs in clusters in the thatch. If you live in a rural area, there's not a whole lot that you can do to really prevent them. In an urban area, we don't see them as much of an issue. But if you were in an urban area maybe and you lived right next to a golf course, or you lived right next to a big sports complex, then you're more likely to find them. They really like huge patches of their favorite grasses, and then they'll move into the other stuff. So I think it's very situational. If you're in a regular neighborhood, you're probably never going to encounter these guys in populations high enough to cause that kind of damage to warrant putting out any pesticides. Now, I think this is the last pest I'm going to talk about here for lawns, because there's just not a whole lot of lawn pests to deal with. But Fire ants are certainly considered a lawn issue. They're unsightly, they're ugly, they are found in our lawn, they hurt us, they clog up your mower, you spit them out all over the place, and then you have stings all over your back as you're mowing through them. So I consider them to be a turf issue for sure. If you managed a sports field or a golf course, you consider them a turf pest, definitely. The way that you know you've got fire ants versus other ants is that fire ants are the only ones that make that above ground fluffy mound when it's wet enough. If it's dry, that goes down flat with the soil. When you step on that mound or irritate their house, they want to come after you. So they will move up vertical surfaces as opposed to moving out horizontally like other ants will. So when I do field work and I'm not quite sure if I'm dealing with fire ants or one of the other 75 plus species, I'll stick just a stick into the mound or into the mess of those ants. And if they move up, then I know I've got fire ants on my hands. They're also the only ones that will leave that pustule. It's usually the minimum reaction most people will have to the stings that they inflict on you. And inside of a fire ant colony is tons of ants. There are hundreds of thousands of worker ants. And in Texas and most of the southern United States, we have colonies that have multiple queens. There could be hundreds of queens that are all laying eggs in those colonies, which makes them really hard to kill when all you see is the tip of the iceberg and you have no idea what's underneath the ground, how far that nest will spread out. And we get them a number of different ways. You get mulch or you get soil or you get a potted plant and you bring fire ants into your yard. They naturally move over from your neighbor's yard. It might flood in an area and they're called a floodwater species. They will float above the ground and then once they hit land, they will crawl and establish their colony. But they also have mating flights where they'll fly up in the air and disperse. And if the wind is blowing nice and well, they can go miles away. So you get them a number of different ways. There's nothing that you're doing that's wrong. It's just that you live in Texas and they're just a part of being here in Texas. The one thing about fire ant colonies that I think is so interesting is that have you ever gone outside after it rains and there's this giant mound that's popped up between your yard and your sidewalk or your driveway and you're wondering where the heck did that come from? They don't start out in these gigantic colonies. They start out from one mated queen that lays eggs, feeds those babies, and then those babies grow up and they feed their queens. And then the queen makes more queens, and then there's hundreds of them just popping out, thousands of babies every day. So they don't start as a big nest. They start as a teeny tiny nest that we don't even notice. And underneath that mound that you see above the ground is this really intricate, many little rooms off of this giant mansion that they have. You can see that picture on the right-hand side is still a professor who studies fire ants. His name is Dr. CHINCH from University of Florida. He's probably retired now, but he is very well known for digging up ant colonies and then pouring melted aluminum into the colonies and then going through and excavating it out and making these awesome pieces of artwork. But by doing that, he was very instrumental in helping us understand how these colonies are laid out. So you can see at the top, that's where the most of them are, right? That's where most of the rooms are, but there's so much happening below. So if you go out there with your gallon of boiling water and you pour it on top, yes, you're killing that big chunk right there. There's no way that water is still boiling as it gets down to the very bottom. So drenches are usually not the best way to control them just because of the makeup of that colony. We've got lots of options for treating for fire ants. You can pick the one that is your favorite. There are organic and traditional options for all of these formulations. We have baits, we have granules, dusts, and then drenches are the liquid forms. So if you just want to treat individual mounds because you only have a handful in your yard, then you can use pretty much anything, right? Drenches and dusts are probably the better of the two options there. There are more options here if you have fire ants building nests inside of your vegetable garden. You have to read the label very carefully. You can't just use anything inside of that vegetable garden because you don't want to apply pesticides in there if they're not meant to touch some sort of consumable plant. If you want to broadcast it because you don't want to walk around and find every single mound that's out there, the two options are basically putting out a granule or using a bait. Granules you apply to the lawn or to the soil, and they generally have to be watered in, or there has to be some source of moisture that allows them to bind to the particles of the soil. It essentially leaves a barrier. It'll probably bind to like the first 2 layers or so of the soil, and so you have this barrier throughout your yard. So let's say that you have an extreme allergy to fire ants. If you do, this would be a good option for you. But just know that you're also killing, or anything that comes in contact with that barrier is going to encounter that pesticide, and you're probably going to kill it also. So it's not really the most environmentally friendly way to control fire ants, but it has its time and place, right? And definitely there's none of these that are labeled for use in a vegetable garden. To my knowledge, there's none that are also organic. So I guess this is kind of a pros and a cons here for you for granules. It's kind of a messed up slide, actually. Baits are the other option that you have for controlling fire ants, and I prefer baits. In extension, we really recommend the use of baits. Basically, baits are food for the fire ants, so you put it out, the ants take it into their house, they tell their buddies, they feed everybody, and so you're essentially putting out far less percentage of pesticide than you would if you were sprinkling a dust or pouring something on top of a mound, and certainly much less than if you were applying a granule everywhere. They remove it from the environment. It's fairly target specific. Now, there are other ants that will pick it up, but fire ants are one of the few ants that really like that oily, greasy stuff. So if their fire ant population is really high and you put out fire ant bait, they're going to kick everybody off of the food, and they're going to be the only ones that feed on it. We've done tons and tons and tons of studies on fire ants and utilizing baits, and what we find is after we apply baits, our populations of native ants skyrocket because we've gotten rid of that invasive species that takes over territory and food, and we've allowed those guys to rise up in population. Generally, it's more economical to use baits. It definitely controls the colonies that you don't see because they have to eat also, but it's super easy to ruin it, and it's very slow acting because it has to make it through all of those homes, right? Through all of those little galleries, and every single little thing looks like a pancake. Those are all places where a queen is laying eggs. So it takes a while to make it all the way through the nest to kill everybody, which is why it takes could take up to 2 weeks. I don't know what that slide was. And there's lots of different types of baits. I would say probably the one that most of us recognize are Amdro type products. There are some organic baits. Fertilome, Come and Get It, has spinosad as the active ingredient, but there's other options that are out there. You go to Lowe's or Home Depot or your local nursery, and the shelves are full of fire ant baits, especially this time of year when fire ants are really prevalent. I would say that how you apply the baits is better than what you use. So read the label for the rates. Don't over apply. Don't, if it says to put, a half a pound out in, I don't know, 100 square feet, don't use a full pound for 100 square feet. The fire ants will actually think there's an excess of food and they won't pick it up. It's better to go below the rate than it is to go above the rate. Make sure that you apply the bait that is fresh. When you open that container, it should smell like, hey Nick, can you go on please and make sure that everybody's muted because I'm hearing a lot of background noise right now. So make sure that I might be on a phone call, sorry. Make sure that the bait's fresh. If you open it up, it should smell like it is like potato chips or something. I know it sounds weird, but if it smells like a chemical, it's bad. Throw it out. It's not good. And then try to put stuff out when they're actively foraging, which is right now. It's warm enough. But if you're not sure, put out a hot dog, a greasy potato chip, a Cheeto, and if ants go to it, put out your fire ant bait because they're looking for food. I don't recommend taking it in a cup and throwing it out because you're not applying it like a blanket. You want to use actually a handheld spreader if you can, so you get a better application rate. And I know it's not fall time, but we always do say to treat for your fire ants in the fall. If you treated this last fall, you probably don't have any fire ants right now in the spring. But you can still treat in the spring. Just remember to try to treat in the fall because generally you won't have to treat in the spring of 2021, fall is just the best time to treat if you got to do it. And then you're generally not using a lot of pesticide later on. You're down to just one time treating for your fire ants. And that's, if you're somebody who's out there messing with them all the time, that's pretty remarkable. And then of course, there's people that certainly still do this, unfortunately, and that's not a good way to kill the fire ants because first of all, you're only killing that top part of the mound, right? You're not killing what's underneath it. We do have 2 really great websites if you have questions about turf and also about turf-related insects or diseases of turf. Aggieturf.tamu.edu is excellent, so I would recommend that you go there to get information about anything turf-related. And then if you're just worried about fire ant information, we have a fire ant website, fireant.tamu.edu is another good spot to go. Really quickly, I just wanted to show you a couple pictures of when insects aren't necessarily to blame, and it's another thing that is going on with your turf. And you can see that these guys are the damage that happens when it's a disease looks like white grubs or other things. It's not very typical. So you might notice early on in the like right when the first frost happens and it really hasn't frozen the ground solid total, you go outside and it looks like your lawn looks like a leopard. No insect is doing that. It's actually not even a disease. That's frost damage. It just hasn't completely frozen, so it leaves splotches. There's still pockets of heat, and so it allows some of the splotches to remain warm and not freeze down. Fairy rings is a fungal issue, but you might think you've got insects. I would say if you've got an issue with something, do you remember a couple years ago it rained every single day in the fall and it was really moist and people were calling me like crazy saying, I know I've got grubs, I've got to have grubs, my grass is dying. You don't. It was not the time of year to have it, but also it was raining a lot. Fungal issues are certainly a major issue of turf. You've probably heard of take-all root rot. That's a fungal disease also. Nothing about that to me says, oh yeah, that's root rot versus grubs. It just looks like dead grass, right? So many of these diseases you have to do a lot of research about, or many of the issues with your turf, you have to really get to looking or call someone out because it's not easy just to take a picture and have it identified. And then large patch, I guess this used to be called brown patch at one time, but the publication, at least on AggieTurf, calls it large patch. That could be insect damage, right? It's just dead grass. There's nothing about it that tells you it's something versus insects. After I said there's no way to tell if it's insects hurting your grass or not, you can still send pictures if you want to, and I can try to guess at what might be happening with it. But in general, there are very few insects that cause damage, and the damage that you see from the insects are going to be later on in the summertime. So if you're having issues with your grass right now, don't blame it on a bug, because it's certainly not a bug's problem at this moment. Thanks for logging on this week for our weekly webinar series. Be sure to check out more of our programs on this YouTube channel.